So, Associate Professor Scott Mooney from the Uni of New South Wales has authored over 70 publications on the relationships between fire, people and vegetation. So, did the land practices of the last 50,000 years really impact the evolution of our flora? It's not a simple story. So Scott will bring us insights from his in-depth study into soils, archaeology and pollen records. Please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for the organisers for inviting me. I don't know if I can answer any of those questions, so let's have a go, hey? I'm from the Northern Beaches of Sydney, that is, so I speak a different language, so my apologies if I speak a little bit fast sometimes. I get excited and I'll try to slow down a little bit for you. That's who I am. I've got a different shirt on. I own 2 shirts, so that's a different one. I went to university to do botany, which is kind of a rare thing, and got sidetracked into geography. And I'm a geoscientist, but I'm a biogeographer by training, and I'm focused on past climate, so it was very nice to hear that introduction in the last talk. And I'm going to show you a little bit about sediment-based archives and some proxies of past climate as well. That'll become obvious through time, I hope. I put a word cloud together of some of my recent titles, and this is what came out. And if you read my title, we're going to talk about climate first. We'll get into fire, and I'll bring humans into the story as well at some stage. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm on Darawal land. I'm a saltwater person, Northern Beaches. I'm a sandstone person, so I just acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land, and obviously pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that to any Aboriginal people present. Thank you, Tim, because he's provided an introduction to a lot of the things I'd like to talk about as well. And I'd like to start with climate, as I mentioned. And some of these diagrams are a little bit complicated, but I'll try and walk through them. So this is the last 70 million years. This is a time axis on the vertical axis there, up to the present. And then this wiggly line through here is a proxy of past temperature. Now, it's from ocean cores, and it's from the change in oxygen isotope in forames. None of that you need to know, except for it's got something to do with temperature. And it's got these, a large, it starts off warm. This is when you went to school, you might have known this is the Tertiary Period, now more commonly referred to as the Cenozoic. And so we'd start out the Cenozoic warm, a long decline, which includes association with Antarctica gathering ice, and then eventually the Northern Hemisphere gathering ice. But you can see right up the top here, as we come to the present, this further decline in climate. So if we jump up until the last 5 million years, this again, the axis this time coming this way, so this is 5 million years ago. These ups and downs are another proxy for temperature. It's from an ice core this time. Let's just call it a proxy for temperature. You can see all these wiggles, and the wiggles get slightly larger, and then they get very larger. These are the glacial and interglacial cycles that you've all heard about. And when I went to school, I was told there was 4 glacial and interglacial cycles, but guess what? There's hundreds of them. And so when Tim was describing the last 40,000 years ago, that's in here. I'll show you in a moment. That's that glacial and interglacial cycles, and the response of vegetation have happened over and over again. It's amazing to think about that we live in a world with dynamic climate. And, I hate to feed into climate denialists, but climate does change all the time, and this is an example of that. If we jump to the next step, this is the Quaternary. This is the last roughly 2.6 million years ago, and my apologies, the time arrow is going to flip-flop, so I'll point that out each time. This is time going this way, so here's the present over here. This is roughly 2.6 million years, and it's focusing on those Quaternary glacial and interglacial cycles. Here's all these fast cycles. They're 40,000 years apart. It's associated with one of the parameters of how the Earth goes around the sun. It's obliquity, which is the tilt. So there's a tilt component here, and then when you get in the last 800,000 years, another component takes over, which is eccentricity, 100,000 year cycle. So these glacial and interglacial cycles change through time, and then the last 7 or 8 cycles have been big and longer. If we then jump to the last 160,000 years, this shows you the last full glacial cycle. Now, Tim was focusing on 40,000 years ago. The full glacial cycle starts with an interglacial and then progressively cools, and then a rapid recovery up into an interglacial. So here's the current interglacial that we're in, back through time to the glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, and then you've got to go back to 120 to 130,000 years ago to get comparable conditions. So remember, that's the last cycle. That's that cycle way over there, and look how many we've had. So obviously our climate's changing, vegetation's also changing. I'll just show you a couple of the sort of iconic vegetation records. This is a record of pollen changes through time. Now, pollen is a proxy for vegetation, and vegetation, once you can reconstruct vegetation, you can start thinking about what's driving those changes. Now, pollen you can resolve to various taxonomic levels, not always to the species level, sometimes to the genus level. Pollen's well dispersed, it represents vegetation somehow, and it's resistant if it's in the right conditions. So if it's in lakes or swamps, then you can get a record of vegetation through time. So this is the Lake George record. It's made famous by a guy called Gerdit King, who's now deceased. And it's a long record. There's some radiocarbon dates here, and it's well beyond radiocarbon dating. In here, there's a series of pollen, individual taxa. Each one of these lines represents a slice of the mud where people have concentrated out the pollen and then counted the pollen. The actual pollen diagram is longer than my arms. It's absolutely huge. So I've just put a couple of them in there, and then there's some summary diagrams. So the ups and downs in this Lake George record are glacial and interglacial cycles. You can see here, this is the last glacial maximum just in here. And the last glacial maximum, the vegetation was very different. There's a number of big take-home messages from these long pollen records. You know, the vegetation we see today is relatively young. At Lake George, the vegetation which you see as you drive down to Canberra is about 8,000 years old. And even then, if I go back 8,000 years ago at Lake George, there was significant cool temperate rainforest in that local environment. That pollen doesn't, it's not well dispersed, so this is definitely local. So, you know, one of the take-home messages is vegetation is dynamic. If we go back to previous interglacials, the current interglacial has got eucalyptus in it. Previous interglacials have casuarina dominated. And if you go to the glacial time, there's hardly any trees in that landscape. It's actually herbs and grasses, particularly daisy, and a daisy that's not in the modern environment. If we have a look at other Quaternary records, this is Cale Snyderman's work, and this represents just the very early Quaternary. It's that time when the obliquity, the 40,000 year cycle is happening. It's from 1.8 to 1.6 million years ago, and incredibly detailed work, thousands of hours of work to count this pollen. But you see these fantastic up and down cycles. And something in here, there's a whole lot of the southern conifers in there, which are now restricted to refugia and not there now. And one of the cool things about Cale's work, it shows the level of extinctions we've had associated with glacial and interglacial cycles, local extinctions. Lynch's Crater is another one of these famous long records. This is associated with Peter Kershaw's work. It's from northern Queensland, up near, it's the Atherton Tableland, it's up near Cairns, and it's an incredibly important location. One, it's one of the longest tropical records we have in the world of vegetation, but it's also important because it's in a climatically important place. Now, this is, again, a summary diagram, and I'm going to go to a summary of the summary in a moment, but if each one of these lines represents a layer of the mud where they've concentrated out the pollen. This is the summary diagram, and here, this is time. It represents 2 full glacial cycles. So here's an interglacial down to a glacial maximum, up to an interglacial, down to a glacial maximum, and then up to the glacial. So it's 2 of those cycles that we saw many of in the longer records. The amazing thing about this record, it follows climate. This is a proxy for temperature. It's a global proxy for temperature, and you can see that vegetation follows roughly that temperature record. Final one I'll just show you. This is Iramu. It's also on the Atherton Tablelands. It's another one of these crater lakes, an amazing record. This is from Simon Haberle, a professor at ANU, and it shows the recovery. This is the glacial maximum down here and a recovery up after the glacial maximum. The interesting thing about this is that you go into the wet tropics of Queensland and you imagine that that's a timeless vegetation. It's kind of seductive because it's got some old members of the angiosperms, and I've been on one of those tours where they say we're standing in an ancient forest. In fact, it's not true. If you go back to the last glacial maximum, there's no record on the continental landmass of the vegetation that's there now. And if you go back 12,000 years, it's completely different. Let's get on to fire. If vegetation changes, then we would imagine that fire changes as well. Fire and vegetation obviously linked. Things like flammability, some vegetation types are more flammable than others, and different vegetation types have different fuel loads. I work with charcoal, which is a proxy of fire, and I've used the word proxy just a couple of times. I've shown you temperature records and vegetation records. A proxy is just some substitute. When we don't have an instrumental record, we use proxies to get these longer views. Having a longer time frame allows us to look at things like why are things changing? Not only how are they changing, but why they're changing. And the proxy I use is charcoal accumulating in sediments. So this is a sediment core from a swamp, and I sieve out charcoal, and I'll show you some charcoal records. This is my favourite picture. It's a temperate highland peat swamp on sandstone near Lura. So I work on swamps. I take sediment cores, as I just showed you. Amazingly long amount of peat in a whole lot of these records, even in this region. And I sieve out charcoal, high-resolution charcoal, and use radiocarbon dating to get the time frame. Charcoal accumulation is been shown to represent the area burnt. Now, we're replicating this study in Australia. This is some Yellowstone work, replicating this work at the moment in the Blue Mountains. But what it shows is that charcoal is a biased record, and it's a biased record towards large fires and severe fire events. So everything I'm talking about, I'm going to give a couple of caveats, and it's particularly true when we talk about Aboriginal use of fire, Indigenous use of fire. It's also possible to look at fire frequency using charcoal. So this is that site near Lura. This is each one of these bars is where we've quantified the amount of charcoal in a slice of sediment. It's possible to put a moving average through that and then start looking at the peak component, the bits above that background, and then you can count the peaks and we get an idea of fire frequency through time. So here is the fire frequency of the Blue Mountains, local, because it's macro charcoal, it only represents local scale, but you can see I can provide a 10,000 year record of fire frequency, large, severe, in asterisks. The final thing I'd just say is that we can also, in my lab with recent graduate, Dr. Mark Constantine, we've been using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Sorry, get that out. FTIR, much easier. And we're zapping charcoal and we're looking at the spectral response of the charcoal. And it turns out that not all charcoal is charcoal. If you burn charcoal, if you burn wood at much higher temperatures, you get different spectral responses from it. So we're building a model to work backwards. Can we work out how hot the fire burnt using FTIR? Turns out we can, which is really exciting. So I've been working on this for a while. We have a number of records in Australia. This is 224 records in Australia. And it means we can look at the long-term record of biomass burnt in Australia. And up the top here, this is a 70,000-year record. And this 70,000-year record follows what we understand about climate. Talk more about that. Just to get back to that idea of climate, it's complicated, but this is well worth considering because when it came out in the late 1980s and then into the 1990s, everyone said this can't be right. What it shows, this is time, 60,000 years to 10,000 years, so the time arrow is coming this way, and this is ice core records. Unlike ocean cores, ice cores form at a much better resolution, so you can see more detail. And in this record, up the top here, all of these squiggles are temperature-sensitive proxies. It's either delta O18 or delta deuterium, but they're temperature-sensitive. This is temperature where the ice formed. So it's Antarctica. These top three records, Bird Station, Epicodome Montland, and Epicodome C, these are the long ice cores from Antarctica you've probably heard about. This one is the North Greenland ice core. You also, I hope, heard about Greenland as a major source of these long records. The fantastic thing about this, well, the amazing thing about this is all these ups and downs in climate. When this came out, people thought it was a mistake. They really did. It showed that climate was not only dynamic, but had multiple stable states. It led to all those fears that maybe climate will change dramatically on us. Turns out that these ups and downs are associated with having ice on Earth. And on the northern hemisphere, particularly those big ice sheets, they get so big that they slip off. They generate their own heat because of pressure, and they slip off and they form changes to global temperature. So these ups and downs, you can see the ups and downs are also happening in Antarctica, just to get closer to us, but the shape's different. If you have a look at the Greenland, northern hemisphere, it rapidly goes up and then progressively cold, up and then progressively cold. And that's referred to as a sawtooth pattern, very reminiscent to the pattern of the glacial and interglacial cycles. In our part of the world, they're more sort of triangle shaped. They change more slowly up and then more slowly down to give this sort of shark's tooth pattern. And if you look carefully, when it's cold in the northern hemisphere, it's warm in Antarctica. This is part of the bihemispheric seesaw. When northern hemisphere is warm, we're cold, and vice versa. And I don't want to suggest that the equator is the pivot, because the actual pivot point, the fulcrum, has been changing through time as well, just to make it more complicated. So, when we start looking at those charcoal records from Australia, and I would just highlight, this is a synthesis of charcoal across the Australasian region, 224 records in there. This is time, so we're looking at 70,000 years to 20,000 years on purpose. Remember, we've got to bring people into this, but this is what we see in the biomass burning across the Australian continent at that scale. And if you look at that carefully, there's a number of things in there, but it looks like these ups and downs are associated with those ups and downs in high latitudes, a climate-dominated system. Now, there is an increase at 50,000 years there, or soon after 50,000, that we'll come on to talk about. That Australian work got subsumed into the Global Paleophile Working Group, which is a large global database. This is the global database. This is 2009, so it's more than a decade ago. More than a decade ago, there was 1,000 sites in that record. It's now well over that. And it allows you to look at what's happening with global burning. So what's happening with biomass burning, and again, this is a 22,000 year to current, and this is global coming out of the last glacial maximum into the Holocene, and you can look at what's happening in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere. So it's clear from these records that temperature and climate is what's controlling controlling fire, biomass burning at that scale. Yeah, and you can actually look at that statistically. This is Anna Lord Danielle's work, again, more than a decade ago, and she looked at the association between those long records and proxies of climate and was able to show that temperature is important. So obviously we've got to bring people into this story because we live in a continent with an amazingly long record. I'm sure you've heard of this, that a couple of years ago people argued that scientists had argued, a whole lot of archaeologists had argued, in fact a whole lot of people from University of Wollongong in amongst those group as well, argued that people had been in Australia for 65,000 years. It's a hell of a long time. It's also, when you ask Indigenous people, they say they've been here forever. They may as well have been. This is forever. This is the site. You may not have ever seen this, Northern Territory. The record here, it just shows what the landmass was probably like at the last glacial maximum, as Tim had shown. And these are some of the artefacts they're finding from the base of that sequence. This is what the site looks like, amazing rock shelter. Unfortunately, there's a whole lot of other archaeologists in Australia who don't quite believe that 65 date. Now, that 65 date, there's quite a few issues in terms of history. And one of them is, when did modern humans, anatomically modern humans, leave Africa? And it's unlikely that they're in Australia at 65. It's more likely that was about the time that people were leaving Africa. And if you look at the genetic work in Australia and start looking at modern Indigenous populations and their genes, there's some nice splits between East and West about 42,000 years ago. If you look at all of the old sites in Australia, Tim mentioned the Western Australia Devil's Lair site, they all sort of cluster into about 45 to 50,000 years ago, and that most recent site is an outlier. I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just not supported by the rest of the evidence at the moment. Nonetheless, if it's 40,000 years if it's 50,000 years or 65, there's not a lot of difference. It's a very, very long time. So I showed you the Lynch's crater core, the ups and downs associated with vegetation. One thing I cut off that is Lynch's crater is perhaps most famous because charcoal increases at 42,000 years ago, and Peter Kershaw originally argued that that was people, and that people come in, change the fire regime of Australia, and that you can see in the last interglacial, if you go back to the last glacial cycle, there was a lot more rainforest angiosperms, rainforest gymnosperms, and he argued that this fire had resulted in the expansion of sclerophyll vegetation. That idea that Australian Aboriginal people came into the continent and changed the vegetation is pretty pervasive. That idea, probably first expressed by Major Mitchell in the 1850s, that Aboriginal people used fire to till land and, made famous lots of recent books as well. So Rhys Jones posed this question in this pretty famous piece of work, that maybe the continent's vegetation wasn't natural. And, it's sort of direct opposite to Cook floating up the coast, 1770. He described the place in a pure state of nature. The idea of fire stick farming is fantastic. It's got a whole series of ideas in amongst there. And those ideas, it portrays Indigenous people in Australia as socialising landscapes, that they're not natural landscapes, that they're a human construct, so ecologically important and with human landscapes. It also depicts fire in a particular way. It depicts fire as frequent, low intensity, small patch. So, there's this idea of a Indigenous dominated regime. These are all the words that I would use: frequent, low intensity, small patch. This work obviously is not new. It's not only Rhys Jones. Tim Flannery had a good poke at it in the 1990s. More recently, Bill Gummidge, 10 years ago now, in that book. When we presented this work in 2011, that increase in fire there, we were almost silent about people, and that we argued that it was actually more likely to be a climate signal. I'm not quite so sure about that these days, but there's definitely a climate signal in there. The reason we believed it was a climate signal at the time, it kind of follows what we know about climate, including down into the glacial maximum. I just want to show you a couple of case studies if I have time, and the first one will be from Thalmia Lakes National Park. So if you're familiar with Thalmia, if you're a local, it's not too far from here inland. It's about 100 kilometres southwest of Sydney, up here. And Thalmia Lakes National Park consists of a series of lakes in this entrenched meander, freshwater lakes of course. Dharawal, Dara, Gundungurra people, Europeans turn up there relatively early in the Australian colony, and it's now a national park and part of Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area as well. There's been an inquiry into water levels in Thalmia Lakes through time, and as a part of that we took a series of long cores from the lake to try and get some history out of it, prehistory. A complicated diagram, what it shows is in two colours. One, so we took a long core. It turns out that we have a bottom section which is old. It represents about 135,000 years ago until about 118,000 years ago. And the top section of the core represented about 18,000, the last 18,000 years. So, and there was a hiatus in between. The glacial maximum is not there, but we've got two incredible places, two times that we can compare. One is definitely without people, and one is with people. And so that allows us to look at our proxies and go, can we see people in this record? There's some climate proxies down the bottom here. The previous interglacial was a little bit warmer than our current interglacial, but much the same trajectory. There's some palynology in here, which shows that the vegetation was more or less the same across these periods. Some information about people up here. There was no people in the red bit. There's definitely no people in Australia at this time. And in the black shows archaeological information. One of the interesting things in our region and in most of Australia is this huge expansion of archaeological information over the last couple of thousand years. And we'll get back to that. If we look at fire, at our proxies of fire, charcoal accumulation, so area burned, is not very different between those two periods. In fact, there's some subtle things in here which we're investigating at the moment which are interesting, but the take-home message is that area burned is not very different between with people and without people. What we do find is a very significant difference in fire intensity. And this is the first time in Australia. Now, Peter Kershaw suggested that people had influenced vegetation. This is the first evidence in Australia of Aboriginal manipulation of fire regimes. It's been a nice idea through time, and it's been fantastic to actually add some science to it. The second bit I'm just going to show you is a 900-year record from the same place, the top bit in more detail. Now, we know Aboriginal people were in this landscape. This is Matthew Everington. He's in the very early Sydney colony. He's trying to cross the Blue Mountains, and he's up on the lower Blue Mountains. I heard someone from the lower Blue Mountains before, and he's looking back over the Cumberland Plain at night, and he could see the early settlements, and there was about 4,000 people in the Sydney settlement at that time. But what he could see is these thousands of little fires. And these little fires aren't landscape fires, they're hearths, people sitting around a fire at night, family groups. So we know there's people in there, and he could see all the way down to the cow pastures, which is, Camden Picton area, so not too far from Thalmia itself. When we look at the last 900 years, so this is 900 years in detail, and again, it's a lot of the same proxies. This is area burnt, the amount of charcoal accumulating through time, and then fire severity, and then some proxies for climate and in there as well. We don't see a very big change across the pre-European boundary. And that was surprising to us. We imagined that Thalmia Lakes is fresh water. If people are going to be anywhere, they're going to be at Thalmia Lakes. But I'm just using this as an example of the diversity of occupation that we see, and that we really can't see a clear indication that people are burning pre-European in this landscape. And instead, what we see, and this gets back to a fairly common thing across Sydney, we see fire going crazy in the relatively recent past. Yeah, and at Thalmia Lake, sorry, this is really low resolution, we're still filling in this data, but the area burnt seems to go particularly high since the 1980s onwards, and we're looking at some of those drivers of change. Now, that idea that we're coming into a new fire regime, this is something that's, I guess, we're all fearful of, and it's not just us. This is a series of monographs coming out of America because of West Coast American fire changes. And, you know, we've had a whole series of very large fire all over the world in places you don't often associate fire. You know, southwestern France recently, Portugal, Korea burnt a couple of years ago. So big fire events. Not only have we had big fire events, we've had odd fire behaviour. We've had a whole series of fire events in the east coast of Australia, on the margins of our big cities. Sydney, anyone old enough to remember this? Canberra, ACT, High Country, Victoria, 2013. I'm running out of time, but I do want to highlight 2013 because that's when our previous Prime Minister said there was no link between fire and climate. I'm standing there going, hasn't he read my work? Obviously not. And then the world's best environment minister, something Hunt. It's hard not to use his name without swearing, isn't it? Anyway, the world's best environment minister used Wikipedia to dismiss any links between fire and climate. I don't know where you find that on Wikipedia. Oh yeah, then we had the big fires, 2019. This is when everyone starts going, oh my God, of course. The cool thing is that we have an instrumental record of fire now. It comes from about 1996 onwards, so we've got satellites looking down, MODIS and a whole series of sensors. That allows us to look at real data. Yeah, so it's an instrumental record, not a proxy record. That means that we can get area burnt across Australia, we can get area burnt across New South Wales, and it means that we can put the 2019-2020 fires in context. You know, something like 10 times the average burnt in that time, and, you know, it gets a bit scary when Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, 80% of it burns. So, I've got a series of records across Sydney. I don't have time to show you, but I'll just highlight some of the really important things. One is that if you look at all records across Sydney Basin, there's sites that do not change, and then there's a couple of sites where there's a clear change in fire regime about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And that coincides with this increase in archaeology. And this is the clearest example I've got. This is King's Waterhole, north part of the Sydney Basin. Fire is dynamic through time. Archaeological information changes, goes through the roof, and fire, from what I can see, fire almost disappears from that landscape. Charcoal almost disappears from that landscape, I should say. Fire's probably been very actively managed in that landscape, such that fire reduces. It's not something we normally associate with Indigenous people. We often put a firebrand in Aboriginal hands. this is the diversity of spaghetti we see across Sydney Basin. And I would just highlight, perhaps the last thing I would highlight, that fire in our region, this very region, sorry, the region we're standing in right now, increases from about 500 years ago. Yeah, so it looks like we've become more flammable over the last 500 years or so, and then Europeans come in, the invaders come in, and we change fire regimes even further. So it's not a simple case of this is an indigenous fire regime and this is a post-European fire regime. There's a 1,000 times amount of complexity into that. I won't show you any of this because I don't have time. I was asked to, if I could make some generalizations about how do I make a difference to conservation. And this is, I guess, the fun bit. One is beware of simple solutions. When these big fires happen, we get politicians, we get shock jocks coming out with this idea that we've got to manage fuel loads. Yeah? This is the worst case I've ever seen of it. Miranda Devine. This is, it's like, ooh. Miranda Devine. God, if she had a brain, she'd be dangerous. I sometimes wonder if she does it on purpose. I really don't know. Anyway, this is just after the big fires, the Victorian fires of 2019. Almost 180 people died. She didn't even know how many people had died at that stage because it was so close. It was the weekend after. She writes this in the paper, Sydney Morning Herald, and she said that it wasn't arson, it was the unstoppable intensity of a fire, but she blames green ideology. It's just beyond belief. So this idea of simple solutions, beware of them, and I guess that we've got significant gaps in our knowledge as well. We're working on them. Science works slowly. Each one of those pollen records are thousands of hours of work. I've got people counting charcoal in my lab right now, I hope. And that's hours and hours of work as well. Thank you for your time.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time. If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.